Hi, I want to talk to you today briefly about the difference between sex and gender roles. And the reason I want to talk about this now is because there's this trope that I see coming up over and over and over again. It's used all the time by trans activists, and it goes something like this. Trans people have existed across all cultures throughout all time. Trans people are everywhere and always have been, and therefore, if you believe that biological sex is real and immutable, you are a white supremacist colonialist. And that, of course, is a flaming pile of nonsense. Trans activists are making a confusion between biological sex and gender roles. You see, most cultures across the world and across all time have prescribed specific roles for males and females, culturally enforced and often legally enforced as well. So males can and cannot do certain things, and females can and cannot do certain things. There are roles and rules for what you can and can't do if you're male or if you're female. These are gender roles. And often cultures will also carve out certain conditional exceptions for a few people. And often they do that by sort of creating a third gender role. And this is usually so that feminine males who have a lot in common with women can be kicked out of the gender role and the rules around what men are allowed to do. Because most of the time, men are allowed to do a lot more than women are. There are far fewer things that men are not allowed to do than there are things that women are not allowed to do. So in the case where there are some men who have more in common with women and who don't fit the gender roles ascribed to men, they usually put a special third gender role category out for these men. And they sometimes do the same for women, although that seems to be a little bit less common across cultures. I'll give you some examples of these third gender roles. In the Indian subcontinent, they're hijras. In Thailand, we have what are famously called ladyboys, and there's another katoi, I think, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, in the Thai language. On the Pacific Islands, we have the fa'afafina of Samoa, and there is now, that's for feminine males, and there's another one for masculine females on Samoan Islands as well. Mexico has a mouche. The Middle East has one. Many cultures around the world that exist to this day carve out third genders for certain people who won't fit into the gender roles ascribed to other males and females. But these third genders aren't third sexes, and they aren't putting males into the female sex, and they aren't putting females into the male sex at all. Everybody can still tell who is male and who is female. They're just saying, even though you're male, if you don't fit the prescribed, enforced gender roles for some males, we will put you in a different category, rather than, say, executing you or exiling you from society and culture altogether, which unfortunately still happens a lot of the time for people who don't fit into gender roles. But that's just it. These are just gender roles we're talking about. We are not talking about sex. In India, if you speak to a hijra, they are not going to tell you that they're literally female. They're going to tell you that they're no longer male, perhaps, because they associate male with the masculine gender role. There is a little bit of haziness between sex and gender in that sense, but they insist that they're not literally female. Well, the same with Thai ladyboys. That's why they're called ladyboys. They're not female. We know that. It's right in the name. So in Western society, so-called, in North America and Europe and other parts of the world lately, there's been a real push to loosen and relax strictly enforced gender roles. We're getting rid of laws around gender roles. It's no longer illegal for a man to wear women's clothes, what are designated in society as women's clothes. It's no longer illegal for a woman to wear what is designated in society as men's clothes. Very recently in history, it was still illegal for that to happen. You couldn't go out in public dressed in what was supposedly feminine attire if you were a man. You could not literally go out dressed in what was supposedly masculine attire if you were a woman. And we're even loosening the boundaries and the definitions of what culturally and socially constitutes male clothing, masculine clothing, and what socially and culturally constitutes female and feminine clothing. Gender roles, as society progresses, we're loosening these strict enforcements on gender roles. And that has been one of the central planks of women's rights in the feminist movement and gay rights in the gay rights movement, is that we're loosening these things up That's why there's always been a strong connection between gay rights and feminism. So you would think, therefore, if society is progressing towards getting rid of strictly enforced gender roles altogether, wouldn't that diminish the need for some people to designate themselves outside of the gender role that is strictly enforced on their sex? If you're a feminine man and you don't fit into the strictly societally enforced gender roles that had historically been imposed on men, such as wearing masculine clothing, not being too feminine, taking up masculine careers, having a masculine personality, having sex with women, etc., you might have chosen, or you might have been obligated to, or coerced to, or even forced in law to change your gender identity, to designate your gender as no longer a man, and to even perhaps undergo hormones and surgeries, as well as a name change. That should be going away, you would think, as society progresses. And the same for females who like to wear masculine clothing and who have a masculine gender expression. You would think they could do that naturally without having to adapt a new gender identity, because we're getting rid of gender roles altogether, or we're supposedly moving in the direction of getting rid of gender roles altogether. We're certainly eliminating the idea of gender roles in law. But that doesn't seem to be what's happening, does it? We're in this state of confusion. We're getting rid of enforced gender roles altogether in the West. But society has decided that they don't quite understand what's going on, and they're deciding that therefore we're getting rid of the concept of sex. This is a strange confusion. I think part of that confusion comes from the fact that a lot of people who identify as transgender, their motives don't actually have to do with gender roles directly. They have to do with sex itself. Some men simply want to be female. It's not that they want to identify into a feminine gender role. They want to literally be designated as females, no matter what gender roles are associated with males and females, because they have a mental health condition called autogynephilia, which makes them sexually attracted to females. And for some reason, that sexual attraction, that mating drive, and that pair bonding mechanism that's so deeply evolved into humans is glitching out, essentially, and it's targeting their own bodies. These are straight men who are sexually attracted to themselves in a strange, kind of unusual way, and therefore are determined to make themselves feel as though they're literally female. This isn't actually about gender roles. It's about biological sex changing. Same with a lot of homosexual males who are very feminine naturally and who are same-sex attracted. I think some of the time, not necessarily all of the time, but some of the time, the motive behind these people identifying as transgender is partly to do with their natural instinct to express their gender more femininely, but it can also be a desire to escape homosexuality, to declare oneself no longer male because they're sexually attracted to males, and that negates their homosexuality. So again, this has a little bit to do with with biological sex, and the gender expression part, at least some of the time, might be a cover story. Another reason we're confusing sex and gender here is that even though we've taken laws around gender roles off the books, so to speak, legally, there's still a lot of social pressure to conform to these gender roles. And in the age of social media, in a sort of soft way, this appears to be accelerating. Instagram, the rise of social media and the constant exposure that young people have to media images of men and women, and of course the exposure to pornography as well, is really upsetting people. It's almost making people feel like gender roles are socially more enforced than ever, even though they've been legally completely, perhaps entirely, relaxed. So there's a confusion there that we're enforcing social roles in a sort of soft way, coercively, by making people feel unwelcome if they're not fitting in physically to these beautiful images that are being passed around everywhere on social media. So that seems to be fueling a lot of people's sense that they want to create a new gender role for themselves and identify out of their sex as a result. There's this strange confusion there between gender roles and sex, yet again. It's just constant. So you see this confusion really, really taking hold in things like sports. There are some people, sports are about biological sex. Sports are not divided according to gender roles. We don't take feminine people and make sure that they only are legally allowed to compete with other feminine people and make them not allowed to compete with masculine people. And we don't take masculine people and enforce that they're only allowed to compete with other masculine people and bar them from competing with feminine people. You know, men's sports versus women's sports, these are strictly enforced and divided categories based on biological sex, not gender roles. We want to get rid of gender roles in law and in rules. That's great, but we don't want to get rid of the strict division of the biological sexes of males and females in fairness and competitiveness in sport, because that is not some regressive gender role division. That is a very progressive and biologically fair and reasonable sex division. So when somebody wants to identify as a different gender role than what they think is the male prescribed gender role, that's all fine and dandy, but their biological sex is still male. And that gender role that they're trying to identify out of, a lot of people are trying to say that they don't need to identify out of it in the first place. They may feel a lot of social pressure around being a non-conforming male, but they could learn to cope with that most of the time, it would seem. And same with females who are feeling so much pressure to identify as feminine, they might really, really recoil from all of that pressure and all of the sexual attention and the male gaze that is imposed upon women and the objectification of women. And they may want to identify not just out of the feminine gender role, but to try to not identify as female altogether. And hopefully, it would be great if we could teach these women that you can be a non-conforming woman and still be female. You can be a non-conforming woman. There are ways to understand that and to find your place in society and to empower yourself and to feel whole and good about yourself without feeling like you have to deny the fact that you're female. That's what so many feminists have been saying for so long. Now, of course, on both of these sides, there will always be some exceptions. There will be some females who have such deep gender dysphoria, distress around the appearance of the sex of their bodies, they may need to make some superficial alterations to the appearance of their bodies, and they may want to change their name to a more masculine, typically male name, and all of these kinds of things, and that is understandable. These are concrete steps that some people will take to alleviate the distress that they are experiencing. These are rather drastic steps, so I would hope that these steps would be taken with much consideration and would be taken only in cases of extreme need. Same with males who have a very naturally feminine gender expression, who may feel extreme distress around the fact that they're that society puts all of this gender pressure on men to behave a certain way, and that they don't fit in. And they might want to make superficial alterations to their appearance in order to alleviate some of that distress. Again, I would hope that that would happen rarely, because I would hope that people would be able to come to terms and reconcile with their natural body without having the need to make alterations to it. That could perhaps come with medical side effects that could, limit their bodily health, limit their biological health, and perhaps even limit their lifespans. So there are exceptions. There are some times when people will need medical assistance and medical help to reconcile their gender nonconformity with their sense of self. But even in these cases, they're not literally changing their biological sex. And I would hope that anybody who does need to go through with that, any transgender woman who is male, can at least privately to themselves understand that they haven't literally changed sex, that they're just taking concrete steps to alleviate their own personal mental distress. And they're trying to improve their lives and get on with their lives. And same with females who identify as trans men. I would hope they would still recognize that the steps they're taking to identify as transgender are not literally changing their sex and come with limitations. In fact, my friend Fionn, who just had sexual reassignment surgery very recently, this is a male to female transsexual, tweeted something along the lines that when this person underwent the genital surgery, they actually had to sign a release form that indicated exactly that these are just surgeries that alter the superficial appearance of body parts, and there are limitations to what these surgeries can and can't accomplish. Seemingly implying that you have to acknowledge that you're not literally changing your sex when you're undergoing surgeries. But I digress, because a lot of people who take on these transgender identities don't have any surgeries at all, of course. A lot of people just declare that they have this new gender role That's what these gender identities are, essentially, we're just bringing back old school gender roles and enforcing them. And it's really confusing because, yes, it's true, it's bad for society to strictly enforce what males can and can't do and what females can and can't do in the sense of gender roles. Like, you shouldn't say that some males can't be flight attendants or nurses, or that some females can't be CEOs, or firemen, fire people, firewomen. These are bad, obviously. Gender roles that are strictly enforced are bad, and even socially enforced gender roles are bad. But that doesn't mean biological sex at all is bad. Homosexuality is all about biological sex. Heterosexuality is all about biological sex. Even bisexuals know the difference between males and females, and it will have an impact on which males and which females that they're sexually attracted to. So biological sex has an impact even on bisexuals. So sexuality is entirely around the concrete fact of biological sex, and gender roles really don't play a role in it in that sense. But they do play a role in it in the sense that in other cultures, same-sex attraction is illegal because it violates gender roles. For example, in Iran, if you are same-sex attracted, it's against the law. In fact, it's punishable by death. And even if the state won't arrest you and execute you for homosexuality, they don't need to, because your family will kill you in an honor killing if you continue to be same-sex attracted. What they do in Iran is they force you to undergo a gender role reassignment and to get medical work done as well. You have to change your name to a name that's socially associated with the opposite sex. You have to change your appearance and the clothing you wear. In Iran, there are strict, legally enforced gender roles around which clothes you can and can't wear based on whether you're male or female. And if you're same-sex attracted, you're going to have to switch over to wear the strictly enforced female clothing. And you have the strictly enforced female names and do the strictly enforced female things because the gender role rule around men having sex with other men is completely illegal and punishable by death. I find it really quite shocking that transgender activists take these third gender roles like Iran and hold them up as models of progress. Like, that is not a model of progress, to be forcing same-sex attracted people to change their bodies and to change their identities and to sometimes have surgeries on their genitals in order to be allowed to live as same-sex attracted people. This is conversion therapy at its worst and most sinister form. It's really appalling. It's really, really shocking that this is always held up by activists on the left as progress. It is not progress. Progress is not enforcing the boxes around gender roles and creating new boxes. Progress is getting rid of the idea of gender roles and letting people express themselves any way they want, regardless of which biological sex they are, but still enforcing the fact that biological sex is real and matters. Because in many cases, it does. Sports is a great example. Biological sex matters. It is the foundational reason why we divide sports by males and females. Sexuality is all around males and females. That's why it's called sex. Mammals have been evolving for hundreds of millions of years. Sex dimorphism in life on Earth has been around for, I believe, at least 1 billion years. There is a long and established precedent that living species on Earth are very keenly aware of what biological sex is, and it drives our mating instinct, our sex drive instinct, our pair bonding instinct. It's a deep core foundational part of what the human experience is. And gender roles and gender expression aren't going to change that. So stop telling gay people we have to learn to undo our genital fetishes and start having sex with people of the opposite sex based on whatever gender role identity they put themselves into. It's ridiculous. There are so many other places where biological sex matters. Women's rights activists, women's rights advocates, feminists have been screaming this from the rooftops for so long, and activists are just not understanding that there are spaces that need to be delineated, specifically designated for females only. I think for a time there, when transsexualism was still a pretty rare phenomenon, there were a tiny number of males who underwent significant medical transition to identify into the trans woman gender identity or gender role. When that number was so small, there was almost a sense among a lot of women that maybe we can make a small number of exceptions in many cases, but not all, for this small number of people. So that perhaps if you were a post-operative transsexual who, your penis was gone and had been converted into a neo-vagina and that kind of thing, and you'd been taking hormones and you had been living in the social role of the trans woman for a long time, you might be welcomed into some women's spaces. It might be okay for you to use a changing room once in a while, or a bathroom or something. This seemed to have been the way things were just casually starting to go in society. A lot of women didn't even agree with that, rightly, and that's fine too, absolutely. But now, even the idea that maybe some people can make a few minor exemptions for a few people, there are enough problems with that. I concede that entirely, but I'm just setting up a point here for those who are getting their backs up. But even when it was just supposed to be a small number of exemptions, there were already problems. But now we've turned it into this massive explosion of anybody can declare themselves qualified to use a women's space whenever they want. So we've taken this idea of being sympathetic to people by letting them identify into their own special, unique gender role, even though we don't really need gender roles in Western society anymore at all. Now we've turned it into, once you designate yourself into your own special, unique gender role, you're giving yourself permission to trample on women's rights. You're saying anyone can declare themselves into their own magical gender role, and then once they do so, they're given the keys to the kingdom. They can access any space that is designated for the safety and dignity and privacy of women and females. And this is dangerous as fuck, because these spaces are crucially important to the safety of women and girls. Women's prisons are not there for gender roles women, they're there for females. That's why they're designated separately from men's prisons. That's why they're segregated. Not because of gender roles, but because of biological sex and the deep differences between males and females behaviorally and physically. These have nothing to do with socially enforced gender roles. These are biological, sex-based rights and mechanisms in society. Separate bathrooms, separate changing rooms, separate shelters, separate hospital wards, separate prisons for females than males is not some regressive lingering holdback from the days of gender roles. It is a progressive mechanism society has put in place to help protect women and girls, and it has been massively successful. We've only had women's bathrooms and changing spaces separate from men's in the last century or two, probably not even 2 centuries. This has been an advancement in helping women move and progress in society and have equal spaces, have equal rights in society. This has been super crucial. And it's the idea of gender roles, in fact, that was holding women back a lot of the time. So the idea now that trans activists are bringing back this idea of gender roles and strictly enforcing them, but relabeling them as gender identities. Identities implying that you just pick it yourself, and as long as you self-identify into it, then everything's fine. As long as you're choosing it for yourself instead of society imposing it on you, then, then it's freedom. Then it's, choosy choice. But of course, these people are not just freely choosing to identify into these transgender, new gender identities and roles. They're being coerced by society into doing so. They're under pressure from social media. They're under pressure from peer groups. And with children, they're being designated into these new gender identities and gender roles, often by parents who are deeply conservative, who don't want their children they don't want boys who don't adhere to the strict gender roles that conservative culture and conservative families have espoused. They don't want society to be loosening up gender roles, either in law or in culture. They want men to be manly and women to be womanly, and they see this as a way of enforcing that. So I know I've been rambling a little bit here, but the ideas and the themes I'm putting together are that sex is very different from gender roles. Societies and cultures throughout the world have been enforcing gender roles, but not literally changing people's sex ever. Sex change surgeries don't literally change people's sex. And as Western society, so-called Western society, has been progressing, we have seen a progressive value in eliminating gender roles altogether. And this new transgender identity movement has been about bringing back gender roles with a vengeance, bringing back these boxes, bringing back these categories, and forcing men to be like men and women to be like women, and then just giving people the free choice to take other boxes. That's not progress. That's regress. That's going the wrong way. This should be so incredibly obvious, and I'm going to have to make 100 more videos just trying to decipher what's going on in the psychology of people that they're refusing to let themselves see what is right in front of their faces. That this movement is regressive. It's so obvious. There's a really fascinating psychological phenomenon at play that seems like the entire left has been captured by the idea that this is progressive when it is anything but. So yeah, sex, gender roles, different thing. Gender identity is just a new magical way of reframing strictly enforced social gender roles at a time when the gay rights movement and the women's rights movement have been working and making so much ground in doing away with these regressive ideas. And it's no wonder that so many gender critical people, so many people who are critical of transgender identity ideology, extremist gender ideology, are gays and feminists. Gay rights activists and women's rights activists are the people speaking up the loudest about this most of the time. And of course, also old school transsexuals. The people, like I've said, who have undergone surgeries and undergone medical interventions to help themselves deal with their own gender dysphoria, because often these people are the ones who are the most keenly aware of the difference between one's biological sex and the gender roles imposed in society. They know what sex they are. They know they haven't literally changed it. They still experience dysphoria and distress. I have tremendous compassion for these people. And they still undergo steps to alleviate it and to find a place for themselves in society. But they're not literally changing sex, and they often stand with us. That this new movement is causing problems for them as well. So yeah, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, women's rights advocates, freedom of speech advocates, and transsexuals themselves are speaking up in more and more numbers. So if you're watching this and you're a trans activist, maybe start paying attention and get with the program. Thanks. Take care.